Trigger warning.
Oh.
The following episode is going to touch on things that are political in nature. It might offend you. We kind of hope it does. That way you listen and argue in the comment section.
No one's going to listen anyway.
I was hoping for crickets. We really need to label these buttons. You are listening to The Soapbox. I'm Paul.
And I'm Eric.
This all started out with a list. What's that all about?
So I've compiled a list over the years of things that just bother me, things that grind my gears. And I shared that list with you.
And I thought, you know what? That would make interesting conversation. Sometimes I'm going to want to agree with you, and it's just going to be something we talk about. Other times, though, I'm going to want to steel man the opposite position because I think that's just interesting conversation.
Yeah, and keep in mind, I'm always right, but Paul's just a really good debater.
Hey. All right, today we're going to talk about something that has divided the Commonwealth of Kentucky. We're talking about Amendment Number 2. And for those of you who have not read Amendment 2, the basic proposition is this. Some folks want to change Kentucky's constitution to allow for the potential for the state legislature to offer a funding mechanism for charter schools. And the argument for that is that
private schools, maybe.
Well,
charter schools or
schools,
religious-based schools.
Private schools,
Yeah.
all of the above.
Yeah.
And those for it think that that's diversity in educational opportunity. Those opposed think that it's taking funding from our schools. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot more to unpack on that topic. But Amendment 2 is not actually a funding mechanism. It's not changing anything. It's laying a foundation for the 2025 Kentucky General Assembly to take some kind of action.
Yeah.
Currently, there's about 45 states in America that have that. And it's my understanding that it's legal in 49 states to have a funding mechanism for charter schools. Kentucky is the only state in America that doesn't have that. And so all this is doing is just bringing us up to snuff with the rest of the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some other things to unpack there. And again, not only charter schools, but we're also talking about like religious schools and others. But but private schools, I think, is the umbrella that covers all of them. The schools that are not funded through public taxes.
Sure. So the position I'll be taking today, and again, keep in mind the format here for those of you who maybe haven't listened in the past. We're going to steel man both sides of an argument. And so if you disagree with me, feel free to do so respectfully. If you hate me, please do it for more personal reasons than this topic today.
I can give you guys a list. Just send me an email. I'll give you a list.
Eric does love his list. So that's true.
And speaking of which, so one of the things that was on my list from many, many years ago before this Amendment 2 business came up was private versus public schools. So
let's use that as kind of our jumping off point. What caused you to put that on the list to begin with?
So I think we'll get to school sports. I think that's a component of it that one of the things that grinds my gears about this. But maybe just kind of overall, the public school system is really, to me, and I've got a lot of friends that are teachers in Fayette County and others, and I see in Fayette County, I feel like we have a really good public school system, and I like to support it. But one of the things I definitely notice is, it's a public good, which we may talk about on this podcast in general, but we are using taxes in Kentucky to fund a system so that everyone can go to school, get educated, and we want generally a good education for all. There are people that are fortunate enough to have money or even a religious conviction where they want to go to a private school. So they pay money, they get arguably a better education, or they get an education that's more along their ideals, which, makes sense. I'm not going to say I'm against that, but my thinking is I would much rather put more money into educating as many people as we can in Kentucky, because you can make the argument you have kids, you don't have kids, but no matter what, you're going to encounter people that are educated in Kentucky. And I think just by and large having the best education for the people, whether they're flipping your burgers or doing your taxes or any of it. Just having good educated people is a good thing, and I don't think that needs to be based on how much money you have. So.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, thank you for acknowledging that religious education is superior and all of the implications that might have.
Oh man, I'm gonna have to do some editing.
So framed as you framed it, I agree. I think that when the water in the harbor rises, all boats rise with it.
Right.
And if that were the underlying assumption behind public versus private as the primary driving force, I do think you would see a lot less pushback. Mm-hmm. I think the pushback manifests on a couple of different levels, and I think those levels, the nuance where that manifests, is where the discussion should be, and maybe where it's not being had. So I would put a pin in unilateral quality of education. First of all, because I don't think that's going to happen anyway.
Sure.
I think when you're looking at where kids go to school, you're going to see regional differences, and not from a funding standpoint, but from just a cultural standpoint, the quality of the education will be better or worse depending upon the community where the education is happening. I did a fair amount of substitute teaching in Fayette County, and even though there wasn't great funding disparities between certain schools, some schools were in areas where the culture was that children were quiet and respectful, and other schools were in areas where the cultural difference was that children didn't have a lot of discipline in the home, and they acted however they wanted to act, and the quality of the education was mostly just about behavior management and not about imparting wisdom and knowledge and skills on the next generation. So there are some things that funding won't solve.
Oh, for sure.
And so there's already going to be a disparity, and I'm not saying that disparity is necessarily a reason why funding should be denied to certain schools and offered to other schools. But I do think it's worth dealing with realities rather than ideals.
No, and I agree. And with your point that you're not going to solve everything with more funding. I will say, though, that I think you have opportunities to help a lot of schools by getting more funding. And then I will argue, too, that I've observed a lot in certainly the school systems. I've been involved with my kids. We live in a good side of town, and the schools really are great. I mean, all the schools my kids have gone to have been schools that my wife went to. They're really good schools. The other thing that brings is the parents in the communities can donate money.
Yeah,
and
so
see
the
a
more
lot of
affluent schools have better sports programs and more active PTAs and more active fundraising mechanisms, and more effective fundraising.
And I've often argued, and you've seen the list, so these types of arguments are on the list. I always feel like anytime we can generate money and give to our school, we ought to take some of that, or even match it, and give to a school that we know can't generate that.
Yeah,
because it just feels dirty. It feels like our kids are already pretty well off, and they're going to these great schools, and parents are like, that's not enough. We need more funding so they can go to New York, and all this is great, and I know, but it kind of makes it more like a private school, and I don't know.
So what you're arguing for is an idea that was put forth, I think, in the 1970s by a guy named John Rawls. And he came up with this thing called the Rawlsian ethical framework. And that's the notion that there is going to be injustice in society. And we know that. And since we know that there's going to be injustice in society, we should always tilt the scales in favor of those most disenfranchised, right?
Okay.
Which is kind of a foundational idea in modern liberalism. It's this notion that somebody's going to have not. So the haves need to sort of take a little bit more and give to the have-nots. I would like to maybe unpack a little bit more. What do we think are the implications of diverting funding? Because if one group receives money, the first assumption that I'm going to challenge is that the other group is denied funding. And so this is where I guess the distinction of charter schools versus private schools comes in. And also, I guess we'd have to sort of have an understanding on what are we as individuals paying in taxes for the time period where we're funding somebody's education. I have 3 kids. There's a 6-year difference between all 3. And so presumably if they do 12 years of public school plus kindergarten, they're in for 13 years. I'm going to be paying for school personally for nearly 20 years. So should 20 years of my tax dollars be diverted from my income directly towards my children, or is it a community pot? Right. And I think the answer is I'm not paying as much as what my children are receiving.
Yeah. Already
I know that because the average Fayette County student is receiving about $18,500 annually in expenditure.
Yeah.
And if I had to do that by 3, I'd have to take on a second job.
Right.
So I don't think that the argument that is in favor of funding public schools because it's my tax dollars holds a whole lot of water. Right. Because you could argue, well, I only want to fund the streets that I drive on, right? And let's map out a route, and I only want to pay to fill the potholes on that route.
Exactly. I mean, it's at some point it becomes kind of a administrative nightmare to try to do anything like that.
Yeah, but I think the argument that's currently on the table is more nuanced anyway, because I don't think that it's necessarily, well, first of all, it's definitely not proposing a funding solution. It's only opening the conversation, opening the ability for the state legislature to even think about private funding. And then it also isn't directly looking at taking existing funding sources away from public schools, as it is just giving the legislature an opportunity to create a new funding source, which I know we have a hard time balancing our state budget anyway. We haven't funded our pension system for years, and it's near insolvency.
I just got out of a meeting yesterday where we're talking about, I mean, the gas tax is still just a nightmare. You've got all these electric vehicles on the road that basically aren't paying into the wear and tear on the roads. And, you know, we've got to come up with solutions, and they're trying. And again, administratively, it'd be really hard to, unless everyone's willing to let us track their location and everyone just pays vehicle miles traveled, which
is going to really resonate well with the libertarians who want the government to know where they are at all times and where they're traveling.
No, and I guess what you're saying sounds benign. You know, all they're really trying to do with Amendment 2 is remove this this block where you can't use these funds for private schools. And again, I'm speaking blanketly of private schools, considering that that includes charter and
truly private schools,
or religiously
because
based.
The difference between like a charter school and a private school, the charter school may still be run by the state, but they can do their own curriculum and they can exclude certain students based on whatever measure.
Yeah, and I guess this is semantics at this point, but point being is those schools, charters and religiously based schools, can't get funds from public funds, right? Currently,
that's my understanding.
Yeah, so they're just talking about removing that, which I agree doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to lose funding for public schools. It just may mean we're going to gain the option to fund these other schools as private schools. And yeah, where I get nervous there is just balancing the budget. I don't know where else it's going to come from other than public school funds. I bet that's going to be the first thing that's going to be considered.
I do think it's something that will be considered, and I think it would be dishonest to ignore that fact. So I'm not going to make an argument for something that I know to be untrue. But then I also maybe want to think about why would people want to do this? And I can think of several notable examples for why would somebody want to participate. And I think we do need to break up a distinction here between the charter school and the purely private school. Because the charter school might be something like an all-girls school. Mm. And you might want your daughter to go to an all-girls school because when boys are there, they're going to be a distraction. They may harass your daughter. She may feel more comfortable learning among her peers when that element of her adolescence is not present, right?
No, we just use the public school dress code where women aren't allowed to show any skin, and that solves that problem.
Was this public school of Iran, or?
Emma's still young enough. I'll be curious when she gets to the age. Vivian has talked about, oh boy, the school system's so funny about the distinction between girls and boys, basically. And you got to make sure you're not doing anything to attract the boys Otherwise, you have to go home and change. Anyway, that's a whole.
That is a whole other soapbox.
Right.
Let's put a pin in that one because I think we could probably do a 30-minute block just on dress code and the two standards between the sexes. But so the charter school might be an all-girls school. The charter school might be an alternative learning environment, right? You might have a Montessori environment where maybe children have different cognitive abilities, and that cognitive ability is suppressed when they're forced to sit in a chair and for 8 hours do the old factory worker 8-hour shift without breaking attention or being able to move their bodies. And there's something to be said for having a learning environment where people are able to get up and stretch and focus on a specific task and have a project-oriented learning rather than just a rote memorization.
So, and I think that's a great point, but I think a much better avenue for funding those types of schools would be, scholarships or special programs that you apply for. And if you have a child with those needs, you could get funding to go to a school like that. To me, that makes more sense than asking all of the taxpayers to put in more money, money, and then some of it could go there.
Let me ask you the question you were asking earlier. Then, where does that money come from? We're already having conversations about not being able to, fund the gas tax.
Right. And so I guess I'm arguing it shouldn't come from the General Assembly. It shouldn't come from this pot. I think it would make more sense to come from donations for people that had children that went through this and they're now well-to-do and they have money and I know what this parent's going through. Let's put a program together and
so if that was a function of the state, though, we'd still be in the same position we are now where they don't have a funding mechanism. So you could have a philanthropic office, you could have it be grant-based, and I still don't think they have the mechanism to be able to provide that funding under the law as it's currently written. And I think that's the whole point of this exercise.
Right. Well,
it's not determining a funding source. Yeah. It's just determining that
opening up the option.
Now that option is available.
I guess to me, that's the way it could go, crystal ball. But my big concern with this is it's my understanding that all of the private schools that we're talking about, charter, otherwise, all of them are in 3 counties in Kentucky.
So your urban centers.
Yeah, and for those that don't know Kentucky, you're really talking the 3 big urban areas, which means of 120 counties, 100
3 see a benefit.
Yeah, 117 of them are a lot of them are rural, and they don't really have these options. They're not going to see any benefit to this money. So
let me ask you. I'll pivot for just a second, but let me ask you a question about housing. When you were looking for a house, was the schools where your kids would attend school, was that one of the primary driving functions of why you chose the location you chose?
I would say yes, but I'm gonna because I know exactly where you're going here, of course. But I do want to also point out that yes, but also resale value of the house,
which correlates.
Which correlates, yeah.
So why then wouldn't it be a fair expectation to say, if you have a desire to participate in one of these things, come live in one of these communities? Mm-hmm. I mean, I do understand that if you are impoverished, especially true if there are sort of cultural expectations like there are in Appalachia, that maybe there may be economic and social barriers to some people uprooting and moving. But largely, I think those can be overcome in other ways. And why is it then that just the geographic location of where these things are currently is the one barrier? Because also, I think charter schools are new to Kentucky as of 2017. Mm-hmm. So this is a relatively new phenomenon. And oftentimes, even with driver's licensing and things like that, stuff starts in
sure,
dense populated areas, and then it kind of moves its way outward. Is there anything wrong with the expectation that you should just pack up and move if you don't like where you are?
No, but I think you are now, especially when you're talking about rural Kentucky. You're talking about uprooting families and land ownership that is maybe they have property they can live on, but if they sell it, the money's not going to be enough to buy something.
Yeah, I couldn't
elsewhere.
Pack up and move to downtown Los Angeles right now.
Yeah, right. No,
couldn't afford it.
Yeah, and how much of this is accident of birth type argument. I guess what I'm trying to fight for, and keep in mind, neither one of us are experts at any of this, but what I'm really trying to fight for is really to protect the public funds for schools, because any money that gets taken from it, and again, I don't know if that's the ultimate goal. If the whole intention of this is really to find new funding sources to give to charter schools, and it's not even going to affect the public school budget, I mean, I'd be all for it. But I sense something nefarious, and maybe somebody in the listening can point us to some links. I'm sure we'll get plenty of arguments both ways, but it just doesn't pass the smell test to me.
So let me pivot the conversation at this point, because I've largely tried to stay in the domain of charter schools up until this point.
Yeah.
But there is the thing that we're sort of dancing around, and let's now stare directly in the eye of the real topic, and that is the truly private school, and specifically maybe even the religious school, because the private schools that I can think of are either going to be Christian or Catholic in nature. Mm-hmm. There may be some Jewish schools.
What's Sayer? Is Sayer is it just a private school? It's not charter. Obviously, it's been around for a long time.
I'm not familiar with Sayer. I know LCA, Lexington Christian Academy.
And Lexington Catholic.
And then, all the Catholic schools, they're on Clays Mill Road. But what about them? What about the person that says, you know what, in the public school environment, they are now teaching ideas that aren't just independent of Christian doctrine or Jewish doctrine or Islamic doctrine, but in fact, they are in direct opposition to, and I don't want my kids to be in an environment that normalizes things that I find to be sinful or problematic, and I want my kids to experience a religious education where the morals are going to be the default values and assumptions taught in the classroom. Do you find that to be objectionable or problematic?
I mean, I don't have a problem with it, but I do have a problem with public funds going to those schools. I think those schools exist, because a lot of times people that feel this strongly have money, and they're tax-free, which I think is a really important point to this. Any institution that's tax-free.
You might want to research that one. Well, sometimes if you've got 501c3 status, that doesn't mean you're not paying taxes. It may mean you're not paying certain taxes.
Okay. Either way, I don't see a logical separation of church and state funneling funds to those institutions. And I do, again, my sniff test of this is that I think those are the schools that are going to get access to these fundings.
So
more funding.
If we can go back to the point that you made earlier on, if the harbor rises, all boats rise as well, I would say, one, I would ask a question. Is it scarier for you to have public funding being diverted into private schools, or is it scarier to think that private schools aren't well funded and the quality of education is now lacking even more in a community with people with whom you might disagree? Isn't it good to fund those schools too? No,
I think so. I think so. But I mean, I thought we already admitted at the top of the show that these private schools, the religiously affiliated private schools, are operating superiorly to public schools. So
that's an assumption. I don't know that to be true, but I can probably assume that based on how nice the buildings are and how good the sports teams are.
Yeah.
That's a fair assumption at this point.
But
what about the family that they're just scrapping by? They can't afford tuition. They're not getting anything in terms of any kind of grant money, so they're forking out on their own dime. But they do hold that conviction, and they want to be able to participate. Now, cost is a barrier, and participation is not a guarantee. So it's sort of an economic exclusion.
I guess I would argue that the idea that going to public school is somehow going to corrupt your child is probably something I would say, look, you're going to face this in the world, as soon as they go to college or as soon as they get out in the real world and work. And I think we probably need to sit down and have better conversations of how they can do a better job of educating in the house, because there are always homeschool options too, right?
Sure. And my wife and I have talked about whether or not we wanted to do homeschool and private school, and we've opted to, up to this point at least, have our kids be in public schools for that same reason, because they're going to have to engage with people on all levels of society. And one of the things that public schools does for our children is it provides them with a diversity of thought.
Yeah.
It provides them with an experience with other people that are going to appear in all levels of culture, because presumably most people, regardless of outcomes later in life, are going to have to participate in that institution. So they're going to be there right alongside the people that are doctors and lawyers, but also the folks that are cognitively not very well endowed, and they're not going to be participating at that top level of employment and culture either. And I'm not going to name jobs for fear of offending a friend or family member, but there's jobs that some people can do, and there's some jobs that people can't do, and they're going to have to be around all those kinds of people, and they have to be able to relate to them on some level.
Yeah. If we may, I think we should pivot to probably the most important aspect of this conversation, and this is, maybe we'll cap it off with, go out and vote, and consider anything we said here. Look into it, make your decision, but we're not experts, whatever. The real important conversation we need to have, though, private versus public schools, sports teams.
Go team. Love that sports ball.
So just in my, short window of watching my kids go through high school sports, there is, and you've said it, there's kind of a clear demarcation between the religious private schools in the state versus the public schools. And don't get me wrong, there's also a difference between the well-funded public schools because of the parents, and then the other ones. I mean,
I think the primary difference is that God's cheering for the religious teams.
Well, absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, it's
he's going to give them a little nudge in the right direction.
And that's why I'm saying an unfair advantage. I mean, come on. I mean, if you're gonna, I'd like to at least see the prayer script and go, maybe I can make some notes, be like, okay, you can't root for goals, but you can root for corner kicks or fouls to go your way. I mean, let's
the devil will give you fouls. So.
Let's be fair.
Yeah.
No, but there's definitely a clear, and I'm sure you could look at some statistics over the years. There's definitely a clear bend in the performance of some of these religious private schools. And
I wonder if part of that is there's sort of a filter when the public school limits you based upon geography.
Mm-hmm.
The private school does not.
Right. That's where this whole thing's going. Yeah.
But also, there has to be, and I don't know this for a fact. So if you know this for a fact, please on the YouTube comments, put it in the comment section. I don't know what you'll do on Spotify, but I'd like to know: is there any kind of recruiting happening? Because I have to imagine that some coach has got some assistant coach out in the stands watching the big game, whatever the sport is, making notes, and then quietly calling parents later saying, if you want this quality private religious education, we have a spot on the team for you, and you don't have to worry about paying tuition.
Not having to pay. I've even heard, and that's all anecdotal, of course, I've even heard of players joining like a Catholic team, not even being Catholic.
Yeah.
And not even having to convert or anything. But yeah, there's certainly suggestions, evidence of that kind of thing going on. But I think your first point is probably the bigger point. A private school in Fayette County can pull from anywhere in Fayette County. Doesn't matter what their zip code is, and that gives you a pool of players that I think gives you kind of the best chance of getting a full squad. And I'm thinking soccer here, but I'm sure it works with football and others. But whereas in the public schools, you're limited to that geography. Now, granted, you can use grandma's address to sneak on the to get into the school. A lot of public schools have special programs, gifted and talented things, or pre-engineering. And if you get into those programs, you can. And I know some of that's there's probably some mismatching going on there where Lafayette's got the pre-engineering, so we've pulled a lot of great players for our soccer team because of that.
There are rumors in town that they've sort of gerrymandered the map a little bit to make sure certain neighborhoods aren't in school systems with other neighborhoods.
I lived on Berea Road in Spindletop Estates when we first moved to Kentucky-ish, and I went to Dunbar because Dunbar was a brand new school. It was only 4 years old when I got there. And there's no reason that we should have gone to Dunbar.
You drove past the other high school to get there.
Yeah, I mean, but yeah. So there's obviously that kind of stuff going on. But looking at our clock here, we covered a lot. I don't know if we solved anything, but
that's okay. Here's where I think I'm at. Let's actually read the amendment.
Mm-hmm.
Let's think about it. Let's talk to teachers. Let's see how it's going to affect students, and then just vote your conscience and make sure you do show up to the polls. Because if you're not voting, then I don't think you have as much right to participate in the following conversation of either constructive criticism or a little bit of gloating.
Absolutely.
But let's get out there and rock the vote.
Rock the vote. Pod the vote.
Pod the vote.
All right.
Thanks for listening to the Soapbox. Eric, how can people find us?
Well, conveniently, we put everything on our Linktree site. You can go to Linktree, search Soapbox Lex, and you'll find all of our socials there, plus ways to reach us, ways to engage, and some of our original content, so you can see some of the other stuff that we do.